This episode is brought to you by Squarespace.
Alright you guys, what is going on, man? Welcome back to yet another King Japes episode. Now today we're going to be talking about focal lengths. More specifically, why I am switching from the 35mm focal length to the 28mm for my street photography work. Now for a very long time, as I'm sure most of you know who have been watching this channel for a while, the 35mm focal length has been my go-to focal length for years now, dating back all the way from like 2017 up until 2021. It all really started on my Leica M2, getting that 35mm color scope R. I stuck with that, and just to follow the trend, every other SLR camera that I own, I bought all of those cameras dedicated 35mm lenses, mostly for consistency reasons. I found that the 35mm focal length was the perfect balance for me in terms of street photography, at least between a 28 and a 50mm. So it was still wide enough to be able to capture environment, especially with like buildings and people around. You want to be able to capture that, and then on the more narrow side of things where 50mm plays in, it wasn't narrow enough to kind of isolate, but it was narrow enough to be intimate if you needed it to be, so you can get closer and still photograph and get some really nice photographs out of it. So the 35mm for me just overall was my favorite focal length. So after a couple of years of shooting strictly just the 35mm focal length, I started to play around a little bit with the 28mm on my Ricoh GR3. Now the Ricoh GR3 is just an amazing camera, and so I always ended up, it's right here, kind of picking this camera up, going to the city with it. Even if I didn't want to make photographs that day, it would be tucked in my pocket just because you can never miss a moment, right? So the GR3 is, I would contribute this to be the main reason why I am switching over to the 28mm focal length. Now, it wasn't until one day I went out to San Francisco on a super sunny day with the GR3, of course, and I just entered this flow state, and the 28mm focal length just seemed right at that time, and I was able to make images both including environment and also kind of getting a little bit closer to the subjects. And so I realized at that point I love the 28mm focal length, and ever since then I have been experimenting more and more. I even bought a 28mm lens for my Leica M cameras. So on my Besta R2A, I have the 28mm Ultron, which I was shooting on our Utah trip. I also have a 28mm lens here for my Nikon F3. Now I'm going to be comparing my experiences between the 35mm lens and the 28mm lens in just a second here, but before we get into that, I want to give a huge thank you and shout out to our sponsor for this episode, the good folks over at Squarespace. Squarespace is your all-in-one platform to build a beautiful online presence and run your business. Now for anybody out there who owns or wants to start a business, Squarespace is the absolute best tool to create your online website. They have award-winning templates that you can use to get started with your website in minutes, with different pages like a portfolio or gallery, an online shop for your customers to be able to shop from, and my new favorite feature, a dedicated page to upload video. So if you do video work, or if you just want to do teasers or trailers, you can also upload your videos on your website for all of your clients to be able to see and view. So if you guys want to get started with your own website, head over to squarespace.com/kingjapes or enter promo code kingjapes at checkout, and you guys can get 10% off of your first purchase of a domain or a website. Huge thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring this episode. Okay, so back to the 35mm versus 28mm focal length. Sorry, let me get some water. Now, I remember a couple of years back shooting with the 28mm focal length, I would make my photographs, but later on in post, I ended up always trying to crop my images. And the main reason for that is because I was still seeing and was very much used to the 35mm focal length. Now, if any of you guys out there have used a particular focal length before and just, kind of stuck with it, you eventually are going to adapt your vision to it in your photography. So everything that you see, technically you're going to be seeing in the focal length that you shoot the most. So I was shooting a lot with the 35mm lens, and that's mainly the reason why I cropped it. But what I find really interesting about the 28mm focal length is that it's still not super wide. The 28mm focal length, if you really look at it, is your standard wide angle lens. I would say ultra wide is like 17mm, 18mm. 24mm is super wide, but it's not ultra wide. And so your 28 millimeter, I believe, is just your standard, in my opinion, of course, it's just your standard wide angle focal length. The 28 millimeter is wider than 35, which allows you to get a lot more environment in play. If you're doing landscape photography or even street photography, you guys know that your setting really is your playground. And so anything that is around you that you can capture is going to help add to your story, or it can at least. And with the 28 millimeter focal length, something that I found was that there's a certain kind of look to shooting with a wide angle lens and having a subject super close. Same kind of concept as to why if I put this camera up in front of this lens, which is ultra wide, this is 17 millimeter, you'll still see a lot of the background, but your subject looks bigger than life, which is, the camera, of course, in this situation. And that can add a really dramatic effect if you are, somewhere where you're isolated and you have someone standing in front of this huge kind of background. It can give you a really good sense of scale and depth, which the 35 millimeter lens would not be able to. Not to mention, some of my most favorite photographers all use 28 millimeter focal length. So Gary Winogrand, he shot with a 28 millimeter lens. Alex Webb, I believe, he shot sometimes with a 28 millimeter lens. Correct me if I'm wrong, but some of my favorite street photographers shot with this focal length, and just being able to see all of the different layers that they were able to capture, along with just the environment and just that look, that kind of classic street photography look. It's just something that I strive to have in my photographs as well. And it was also a really big driving force into why I want to start shooting or just changing over into the 28 millimeter focal length. So now moving forward, my plan really is to kind of just hone in on the 28 millimeter focal length and shoot with that for a while until I am used to it. There are still a lot of times where I am out photographing and I'll look at a scene and I'm still thinking in, terms of a 35 millimeter field of view, if that makes sense. Mind you, I am not comfortable with this focal length yet. Even though, I love the way the images have been looking, it's a focal length that I still need to get used to. And the only way I can do that moving forward, again, you guys, is just to stay consistent with it. I already bought 28 millimeter lenses for the other cameras that I shoot. And so hopefully, in a year or two, I can come back and tell you guys, my experience with how the 20 millimeter focal length has either changed or made my photography worse or made it better. Who knows what this will be in the next year or two, but I'm very excited for this challenge and I'm looking forward to it. So now that I was able to talk about my focal lengths and what I prefer, I want to turn the mic over to you guys and ask you, what are your experiences with the 28 millimeter focal length? Either the 28 or the 35, what is your favorite focal length? Let me know in the comment section down below. I want to read that, and I really do appreciate, again, every single person that comes to these videos, comments, and just watches in general. You guys are the driving force behind this channel, and if it wasn't for you guys, man, there would be no videos at all. So thank you guys, man, for tuning into this episode. I'll see you guys in the next one. Comment down below your guys' thoughts on the focal lengths. As always, Minolta Gang.